Hi, you guys. My name is Mary Jacob. I'm a graphic memoirist. I'm the author of Good Talk, and I'm going to be moderating today's conversation with, as you know, River Solomon, Torrey Peters, and Alison Bechdel, which is just a fantastic lineup. And when I was asked to do this, I'm not going to lie, I did the thing where my heart actually leapt. Partly because these authors do so many things and their books have kind of broken open whole new worlds for us. So, things you should know. We're broadcasting on Crowdcast. We want you to be part of the conversation. The chat is open for your comments. So the PEN America staff is going to be answering your questions in the chat throughout the event. They're going to be sharing information about the participants. And if you have questions, there's a Q&A button that's at the bottom of your screen. So you can just drop them there. The event's also going to be live captioned. So you can see links in the chat for access. And then we're also going to provide periodic visual descriptions for folks with low vision in our audience. Right now, we're in a frame on the left side of your screen. We see the branding for PEN America and the PEN World Voices Festival in the corners. And there's a chat with lots of comments on the side, which is where people are telling us where they are watching from. You can tell us where you're watching from. That's always great to know. All right, so we're going to get started with the event. Today, we have Torrey Peters, River Solomon, Alison Bechdel. They're going to be in conversation to discuss their latest works in relation to the experiences of transformation, whether that transformation takes place in the body, in the relationships that shape our lives or society. River Solomon's literary and speculative fiction has earned many accolades inside and outside the queer community, and their latest novel, Sorrowland, is an all too eerily familiar feat of Gothic fiction. Rivers, do you want to start with your reading?
Yes, hi, sorry. So again, I'm River Solomon. Just for a visual description, I'm a black, dykish being with short hair, wearing a charcoal color collared shirt with a red and blue cravat. My pronouns are they, fair, and they, them. And yeah, I'm going to read the beginning of Sorrowland for you. So get ready. Chapter 1. The child gushed out from twixt Vern's legs, ragged and smelling of salt. Slight he was, and feeble as a promise. He felt in her palms a great wilderness. Such a tender thing as he could never be parsed fully by the likes of her. Had she more strength, she'd have limped to the river and drowned him. It'd be a gentler end than the one the fiend had in mind. Vern leant against the trunk of a loblolly and pressed the child naked and limp to her chest. His trembling lips lay right where the heart-shaped charm of a locket would be if she'd ever had a locket. So that's how it's gonna be, Win me over with lip wibbles, she asked. And though she was not one to capitulate to bids for love, this baby had a way about him that most did not. There was courage in his relentless neediness. He would not be reasoned out of his demands. Vern reached for the towel next to her. With what gentleness she could muster, and it wasn't enough to fill a thimble, she dragged rough Terry over the baby's mucky skin. Well, she said, cautiously impressed. Look at you. Vern's nystagmus and resultant low vision were especially troublesome in the waning light, but pulling her baby close lessened the impact of her partial blindness. She could see him full on. He was smaller than most newborns she'd had the occasion to handle and had inherited neither her albinism nor her husband Sherman's yellow bowness. His skin was dark, and Vern found it hard to believe that the African ancestry that begat such a hue had ever once been disrupted by whiteness. The only person Vern knew that dark was Lucy. Viscous cries gurgled up from the child's throat but died quickly on the bed of Vern's skin. Her flesh was his hovel, and he was coming to a quick peace with it. His bones were annals of lifetimes of knowledge. He understood that heat and the smell of milk were to be clung to, or else. It was a shame such instincts would not be enough to save him. As much as Vern had made a haven here these last few months, the woods were not safe. A stranger had declared war against her and hers, his threats increasingly pointed of late. a gutted deer with its dead fawn fetus curled beside, a skinned raccoon staked to a trunk, body clothed in an infant sleep suit, and everywhere, cottontails hung from trees, necks in nooses, and feet clad in baby booties. The Fiend's kills, always maternal in message, revealed a commitment to theme rarely seen outside a 5-year-old's birthday party. Another girl might have heeded the warnings to leave the woods, but Vern preferred this obvious malevolence to the covert violence of life beyond the trees. To be warned of bad happenings afoot was a welcome luxury. People might have followed Vern off the compound when she'd fled if there'd been a fiend there discarding dead animals as ogres.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm not gonna lie, I got so excited about your reading that I forgot to also describe myself. So just to cover that, I am a brown woman with chin-length hair and red lipstick, wearing a white polka-dotted green dress, kind of a Indian leprechaun vibe. That was beautiful. Thank you so much, Rivers. And I'm going to have so many questions for you. But I want to also get to Alison Bechdel, who's reading from her latest graphic memoir, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, which details her lifelong obsession with physical fitness alongside her fears of mortality and acceptance of aging. Welcome, Alison.
Thank you, Mira. Hi, I'm Alison Bechdel. My pronouns are she, hers. And here's my visual descriptor. I am a white lesbian of advancing middle years. I have short, graying dark hair. I'm wearing glasses and a gray button-down shirt, which, if this is useful information for you, I have buttoned all the way up. Okay, I'm going to be reading a short section from my book, The Secret to Superhuman Strength, which means I'm going to share my screen and show you some images. My book unfolds in chronological order. It's a memoir beginning with my birth in 1960. So this passage I'm going to read begins with the assassination of JFK when I was 3, of which I have a very nebulous, staticky memory. It's not so much the event that I recall as the TV itself, which my father went out and bought that day. If JFK's death was the defining moment of the baby boom generation, the boomer Gen X cusp that I occupy was shaped by the experience of nonstop television watching. My earliest memories are all mixed up with that glowing screen. I think I recall my mother stretching in a black leotard and my father doing push-ups, for example. But it's very possible I'm mixing them up with Rob and Laura Petrie, who did those things on the Dick Van Dyke Show. I thought Captain Kangaroo was married to Mr. Green Jeans. I believed Miss Patty could really look out of the TV set. My ontological confusion was heightened by the commercials. Swifty was a cartoon character, but the sneakers he was selling very much existed, and I wanted a pair of those high tops as desperately as I have ever wanted anything. But they were forbidden. It's hard to convey in these lax and decadent times just how rigidly policed this sort of thing used to be, or how limited the consumer choice was. The sneakers of this era promised to make me run faster, leap farther, and stop quicker. Little did I know the sneakers of the future would actually do these things. The Adidas juggernaut was still years away, and Nike's moon shoe was not yet a glint in Bill Bowerman's waffle iron, but soon this paltry array in the back of the store would be a quaint relic. Once I managed to break my mother down. When I outgrew those high tops, I was not allowed another pair. Fortunately, Mr. Rogers was on the air by then, and like him, I adopted that benign eunuch of footgear, the deck shoe. At any rate, taking deck shoes on and off was about all the exercise anyone was getting in those days, except for one guy. Of all the characters on that luminous screen, one shone more brightly and bizarrely than all the others. Who could look away from Jack LaLanne? I was not interested in my bust line. I wouldn't have minded arms like Jack's, but he didn't explain how to get those. Housewives in the 1960s did not want bulging biceps. But from Jack, I learned that the body was something you could shape. I didn't notice his condescending tone. Casual misogyny was the air I breathed. My early childhood was a constant stream of remarks about dumb blondes and women drivers and the weaker sex. Not being blonde or of legal driving age, I was able to let those two roll off my back. But weak? I became fascinated with the bodybuilding ads in my comic books. It didn't really occur to me, despite the endlessly repeated word man, that these were male bodies. I just knew I wanted muscles like that, to be bigger and stronger than everyone else. But I didn't have the nerve to send away for the Charles Atlas booklet, or the weight gain drinks, or the strange devices. I knew my parents, who still outsized me considerably, would forbid it. There was much talk of weaklings in the ads, identifiable by their protruding ribs. I was a textbook weakling, but with a simple trick. I could appear to be already possessed of Atlantic proportions. In the mirror, my shoulders went on forever.
That was amazing. Thank you so much. Beautiful reading. And really great to see those images as you were reading. Okay, our next author is Torrey Peters, who is the author of Detransition Baby, which recently made history as the first novel by a trans woman nominated for the coveted Women's Prize in Fiction. Welcome, Torrey.
Thanks so much for having me. Those were great readings. That was really fun. Let's see. I'm Torrey Peters. My pronouns are she, her. I'm a blondish woman, blondish trans woman in a yellow dress, sitting in a, it's like got flowers on it, and sitting in a apartment in New York City. And I'm also going to follow the trend that everyone else has set of reading from the very beginning of my book. It's Detransition Baby. And I'll just kick it off. The question for Reese: were married men just desperately attracted to her? Or was the pool of men who were available to her as a trans woman only those who had already locked down a cis wife and could now explore with her? The easy answer, the one that all our girls advocated, was to call men dogs. But now here's Reese sneaking around with another handsome, charming motherfucking cheater. Look at her, wearing a black lace dress and sitting in his parked Beamer, waiting while he goes into a Dwayne Reed to buy condoms. Then she's going to come out and let him come over to her apartment, avoid the pointed glare of her roommate, Iris, and have him fuck her right there on the trite floral bedspread that the last married dude bought for her so that her room would seem a little more girly and naughty when he snuck away from his wife. Reese had already diagnosed her own problem. She didn't know how to be alone. She fled from her own company, from her own solitude. Along with telling her how awful her cheating men were, her friends also told her that after 2 major breakups, she needed time to learn to be herself by herself. But she couldn't be alone in any kind of moderate way. Give her a week to herself and she began to isolate, cultivating an ash pile of loneliness that built on itself exponentially until she was daydreaming about selling everything and drifting away on a boat towards nowhere. To jolt herself back to life, she went on Grindr or Tinder or whatever and administered 10,000 volts to the heart by chasing the most dramatic tachycardia of an affair she could find. Married men were the best for fleeing loneliness because married men also didn't know how to be alone. Married men were experts at being together, at not letting go, no matter what, until death do us part. With the pretense of setting the boundaries of just an affair, Reese would swan dive super deep, super hard. By telling herself it would be just a fling, she gave herself permission to fulfill every fetish the guy had ever dreamed of, to unearth his every secret hurt, to debase herself in the most lush, vicious, and unsustainable ways, then collapse into resentment, sadness, and spite that it had been just a fling, because hadn't she been brave enough and vulnerable enough to dive super deep, super hard? She saw herself as attractive, round face and full figure, but she didn't pretend that she stopped traffic, nor did she frequently note people standing around to admire the harvests of her brain. But with the right kind of man, she bore a genius for drama. She could distill it and flame it like jet fuel when solitude chilled her bones. Her man this time was similar to her others, a handsome married alpha type who put her on a leash in the bedroom, only this one was better because he was an HIV positive cowboy turned lawyer. He had a thing for trans girls and had seroconverted while cheating on his wife with a trans woman, and the wife had stayed with him, and now he was at it again with Reese. Did you bottom or something? Reese asked on their first date. Fuck no, he said. My doctor said I had a 1 in 10,000 chance to contract it from getting head. He figured that at least 10,000 blowjobs are happening every minute, but that 1 in 10,000 was me. Also, she gave me a lot of blowjobs. Cool, said Reese, who knew that the explanation wasn't factual, but only had agreed to make sure he wasn't going to try to bottom with her. Within an hour, she had him back in her room and confessing from whom he'd gotten HIV and where. Within 2 hours, Reese convinced him to talk about his wife's disappointment, how she was unwilling to let him fuck a child into her, even though his HIV had declined to undetectable levels. He described how much his wife hated the IVF treatments, how their clinical nature reminded her over and over what he had done to put her on a cold doctor's table instead of in their warm marital bed. You're getting a lot more candor out of me than I'm used to, her cowboy said, sounding surprised at himself. The power of pussy, I guess. You might get my pussy, she responded, enjoying herself and aping his cowboy drawl. But a good woman will flay your soul. Ain't that the truth, he drawled back. He lifted a big paw to the back of her neck and brought her face close to his. She sighed, went limp. Her eyes glassily held his. Tell you what, he told her. First, I'm going to own your pussy. He paused, and with his hand still on her neck, he slowly, firmly pushed her face down into a pillow. Then we'll see about my soul. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's really great to hear that in your voice too, to have you read that section to me, which I've read many times. So one of the things that I was thinking about when I was, thinking through kind of what this panel is and what it's asking of us is this idea of vulnerability and sort of speaking for the queer community in different ways and what that means specifically in our work and how we do that. So actually, Torrey, since you just read that, I wanted to ask you, I'll just start with you. With Detransition Baby, you take the act of detransition, which is something that's long been used as a kind of gotcha moment against the trans community, like gotcha, right? You weren't really what you said you were, gotcha, we know this. And you take it as an entry point into a whole life. You do it metaphorically, you do it literally, you do it, right? And I'm really curious about why you made that decision.
When I first thought about it, I think the detransition has all of the same things as transition. Like it's and the transitions are kind of they can be metaphors for all sorts of different things. Like I dedicated my book to divorced cis women because I think that transition stories and divorce stories are very similar. Mm-hmm. But detransition is something that isn't overdetermined. People think about transition and they think they know what that story is, but detransition it's the same story but in reverse, and as a result it kind of inverts everything and you get to see it for the first time. You get to see the way that somebody loses their community with trans women. When you detransition, suddenly you're outside that community. The people have these ideas of who you are and it goes away, but you get to talk about it in some ways without the burden of the overdetermined transition narrative. And then the second thing was that once I decided to write about it, I was like, I feel like this is a story that I own, that it's been taken in some ways away from trans people for whom it looms, like transition is a possibility for trans people and has been weaponized against us. So I'm going to take it, I'm going to use it, and I'm going to talk about it how I talk about it with my friends.
Yeah, amazing. That makes so much sense. Also, just talking about the kind of exile from the community, Rivers in Sorrowland, you're bringing us Vern, who is a pregnant Black teen who's fleeing a cult that she grew up with. She's gone to a forest. She's sometimes a child, she's sometimes a woman, which is the kind of incredible tension that you weave into the book. There's also a real specificity to her vulnerabilities, and there are many. She's facing a lot. Can you talk about that, about building that character and what you were hitting for in those vulnerabilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what's interesting, what interested me in Vern is that on the surface, there's a lot of ways in which she's an incredibly powerful character. She's undergoing this transition, this metamorphosis in the book. I think it's not a spoiler to say it's kind of the crux is that her body begins transforming quite monstrously and in extra natural, superhuman ways. And I wanted to sort of look at the way that contrasted with her youth, her being a lesbian who grew up in a place that wasn't kind to gender nonconforming and lesbians, and she's also someone who's there's lots of ways in which she's at odds with her community. As a disabled child / woman, being albino, having low vision, and all of these things. And I really wanted to play with the ways those vulnerabilities interacted with the kind of power that she takes hold of through the book. I don't know, as a metaphor for the way that all of us kind of make ourselves eventually, for better and worse, and how she kind of, I guess, as she changes and as she grows into this power, sort of reckoning with all the ways that she's been disempowered. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting because, sorry, I'm going to go off on a tangent here. When I wrote this book and when I wrote this character, I was thinking about the way that certain people, and specifically Black people and Black women, are seen as kind of simultaneously subhuman and also superhuman, in the way that narrative kind of gets used to turn us into monsters that need to, like, a specific way that we need to be controlled by the state, and why we need to specifically be targets for violence because we're dangerous and deviant and are sort of threat to a white innocence. And in a lot of ways, Vern is in fact this kind of powerful thing that she is going to be a threat to this structure. And in a lot of ways that's a fantasy, but I also kind of wanted to revel in the idea of Blackness being a kind of inherent rebellion to sort of the white status quo and these power structures. So even though she has extreme intense vulnerabilities, and she also has this power.
Yeah. She absolutely has power. And there is the agency in her is threaded in every page. Alison, when you are, I have to say, when I first got the notes and I realized you'd written a book about fitness, I was like, wait, what? Because you're right. It's like, what? But it was kind of an amazing what, because of course it's not a book about fitness. It is a book about fitness, but it's about mortality and self-acceptance and not self-acceptance. It's also very much about transformation. And then at the heart of this, which it was impossible to ignore because of the time that we're in, because we are in this weird time with our non-bodied bodies sort of being okay and not being okay, and being intensely aware of our vulnerability. It made me wonder how this book began for you. Like, what was the thing that was driving it when you began? Because right now it seems like the perfect time for this book to come out, but you weren't starting with it at the perfect time. Where did it come from for you?
Well, It really came out of this very deep childhood experience about the bodybuilder ads in the comic books. That's just something that has, been a part of myself for as far back as I can remember. And I do love exercise. I had an idea that this book would be about exercise, but that fantasy of being like bigger and stronger than everyone else seemed like the key to it. And, I grew up, I became a feminist. I learned that, that image, this fantasy about the muscle man was like, the definition of fascism. It wasn't really what I wanted at all. But as I've gone through life, I realized that there's still ways that I have hung on to that model, that even though I'm a progressive, even though, I have all my ideology aligns with this, very progressive worldview, there's a part of me that still wants to be the Marlboro man, that still wants to be just the rugged individualist, completely self-sufficient. And so the book was an attempt for me to like work through that and try and eradicate that in myself.
Yeah. No, that makes so much sense too. Also, because of the way that what we're taught is strong in this world. What we're taught is invulnerable, right? What we're taught we need to be to survive. I feel like there's so much of that embedded into your book, and also just in the physical knocking against that. When you were writing it, because it doesn't lend itself to a natural narrative arc. When did you realize what the narrative arc was going to be? Like, it's such a big topic, and yet you did this beautiful thing.
Well, I give myself lots of time to figure that stuff out. I never learned how to make an outline. Like, I can't make an outline for something to save my life. I have to write it first before I can tell what it is I'm doing. So I was just playing around with this, and I actually, in a weird experimental way, just stumbled onto an Adrienne Rich poem that I hadn't read in a long time, but had read when I was in my 20s. Her poem Transcendental Etude, and I just it just cropped up in a funny, spontaneous way in my research, and I realized that this poem was kind of about everything I was hoping to write about. So I ripped off her poem and I started like working it into my story as a sort of ligament, as a narrative arc that holds these things together. It's very much a poem that she wrote, I think, about her own self-transformation when she was coming out as a lesbian after, years of being this very establishment respected poet and a wife and mother, like really upending her life and starting to look at power and privilege and all of these things. And it's just a beautiful, expansive poem that seems to be about everything in the world. And I just use that for my structure.
Yep. Yeah, that makes sense. And you're actually bringing up something that I love to talk about. And Rivers, I'm wondering if you can speak about this in Sorrowland. What other works you were sort of in conversation with as you were writing? What other works were sort of making themselves apparent to you, just either having metabolized them or sort of seeing them in your kind of trajectory as you sort of progressed through writing?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the biggest one that I don't know if it was an inspiration or kind of like a shadow hanging over me, but was Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And just as a work of Gothic literature, but also sort of reckoning with what it means to be made as something that's reviled and despised, and what that does to you. So I think that was the main work. But whenever I get sort of asked similar questions, it's always hard to figure out what the thing is that made it into this book, because at the same time, it's like your whole life, it's everything that you've ever read. Yeah. But that's the work that stands out for me.
Yeah, that's amazing. I kind of now want to go back and read it with that in mind, but that makes a lot of sense. Torrey, what about you? Did you feel like you were in conversation with other works, or even bucking against them? Because I feel like that happens a lot too when we're writing.
I mean, I think that I was really curious. I was like, what happens to the nuclear family, or what happens to this tradition of sort of domestic bourgeois novels, like this kind of, I always, when you introduce a trans woman into it, like I had sort of had these ideas growing up that, like, when people were like, this is the great American novel, people handed me, like, I don't know, Philip Roth or Updike or all these different things. And they were all about families and usually nuclear families. And I was like, well, how does this whole genre work? If, starting with like Jane Austen, like marriage kind of questions, if there's a trans woman in the story.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, I actually want to do that. I want to do comedy of manners. I want to do, family units. Only I want to sort of trouble that, what happens when trans women are involved. And so I wanted it to have a kind of the same sort of, like, a little bit like bitchy voice that like Mary McCarthy's The Group had, like I wanted it to be fun and dishy, like, because I think it could be like, you could be like, what happens to the domestic family when you have a trans woman? And it sounds like incredibly boring, but the best of those novels are in their own way, like, kind of subversive, and they're just like, it's a pleasure to read at the same time that you're like, I think there's a reason we go back to Jane Austen over and over and see Jane Austen as actually being revolutionary. Even at the same as you're reading Jane Austen, you're like, this is a lot of fun, and those were the books that I thought of, was like, I want to put a book into that history or that trajectory or lineage, and I want it to have the fun parts of that lineage.
Yeah, amazing.
Can I just interject something? Torrey, I just wanted to say how fun it is that your book is so much from an insider's perspective and just feels so uncensored. And what a great gift that is. Like, I just love being able to see all that stuff. So thank you.
That is that's very nice for this is going to be a society of mutual appreciation, because I read your book. I read Fun Home and it was like that book also did a family thing, and it's one of the books that I thought of, but I didn't want to be like mentioning it right now while you're still in the thing, So it's really great to hear.
Well, you're also, Alison, you're bringing up something. I have this quote, Torrey, from Them magazine, where you said this, I love trans women, but they drive me fucking crazy. Trans women are fucked up and flawed, and I'm very interested in talking about the ways in which trans women are fucked up and flawed. And I read that and, of course, sort of extrapolated it for my community. And Alison, when you're sort of saying that, I feel the same, the kind of the relief of seeing something that feels real, but intensely, it holds the reality instead of kind of carefully curating it. I know it's a curation no matter what, because you're writing, but there's a way in which you are exposing things that I feel like in these communities, my experience has been to not expose them, right? So like if I'm writing about being a queer woman of color and then talking also about colorism, my whole community comes down to me like, why are you talking about colorism? It's going to make them think it's okay, right? Like, why are you doing that? But that's the kind of boundary that you're pushing. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Who's it?
Yes, I'll say to you, and this is a question for everybody, because I think you're all doing that.
Yeah. For me, I think it's about avoiding the burden of representation, right? That if I'm actually creating these flawed characters, the burden of representation is, have a trans woman who doesn't air dirty laundry, who isn't fucked up, who is like a good member of society. But then I'm like representing on behalf of other people, and usually I feel like the literature that I enjoy is about really particular characters who aren't representing. Mm-hmm. And usually I found that the more I push my characters towards being fucked up, the less other people are like, that's me. They're like, no, that's Torrey. That's Torrey's issues, and it's like, and so that there was a way early on, and like when I was self-publishing novellas, I just pushed that to extreme. I pushed characters who who nobody was like identifying with.
Mhm.
And as a result, it gave me the freedom to actually write about these communities in ways that I otherwise wouldn't have, that I wouldn't be able to do, because people would be like, you're representing. Whereas when they were really fucked up, they're like, you're not representing. You therefore have the freedom to like actually write the same way that everybody else gets to write.
Yeah. Rivers, I'm
Yeah.
curious, do you feel the same thing with the burden of representation, which I love the phrasing of that, but do you feel that when you're writing?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in a lot of ways, this is the first book I wrote that sort of has a lot of sort of intimate exploration of like Black people as a community and things that, aren't all like, good necessarily. I mean, Vern is running away from a sort of Black nationalist separatist community that's kind of, a cult essentially. And it wasn't like, I didn't like pull it out of my ass. It was like based on things and related to the things that I've experienced in, Black churches or, specific sort of more fringe Black religious traditions and experiences. So writing about that was really difficult, but I don't know. I mean, I find immense joy in like writing, like, to use Torrey's word, like the extreme and like also just messiness. Like for one, it's just like a lot more fun. Like, and like it just gets kind of addicting the more you like get rid of the filter and just like be as honest and forthright as possible. I mean, I don't know. Ultimately, like, no matter what you say, people are going to either misrepresent it or like, say something fucking stupid about it, or like, like there's no, like, you don't really have any control over that. So you might as well like say what you want to say, as best as you can, and like know that this is for the people, who are my people. So yeah.
I'm going to just tell the audience we're going to be turning to the Q&A in just a few minutes, so you will get to ask your questions. Please pop them in. But Alison, I'm also wondering, because your career has had such a span, and because the writing to the community and the burden of representation clearly has to be very different from when you first published until now. How do you feel that? How do you wear that?
Yeah, I've just been thinking about that. When I first started writing my comic strip Dykes to Watch Out For in the early 1980s, it was very much like a sanitized representation. I mean, not completely. I was showing real life, but not anything complicated or anything too negative. And only over time did I start introducing more complex characters with, difficult sides to them. And then I realized what I was really doing with that comic strip was kind of trying to make room for myself to write about the ultimately flawed character of myself, which eventually I felt like I had a space where I could do that, where I could write about my own weird idiosyncratic life, which is now what I'm doing.
Yeah, where you have the freedom to dial into the specificity in a way.
Yes, in a way that I couldn't have 30 years ago. It just wouldn't have been possible.
Yeah, that's such an interesting thing to kind of live through, also to observe, right? I feel like I'm observing that kind of throughout many realms right now, which is really, it's exhilarating. And it's also, I find almost painful sometimes when I see writers coming into their own and realize how much burden they were living under not to do that, how many different things they had to hold up as they were walking carefully into publishing spaces. We have some questions that are popping up, and I don't want to take away from other people's. They all love you so much. They have some questions. This question is, I think this could go for all of the works, and I'd be really curious, what scenes did you have the most fun writing? And fun can take any form here. I feel like we are now talking about fun as like fun can be cathartic. Fun can not look like fun on the page. In the books that we're discussing. And did you have any ideas that didn't make it to the finished product? I know you all had ideas that didn't make the finished product. So thing you maybe most enjoyed writing, and something that didn't make it into the final book. And this can go for, do you want to start, Alison?
I think I had the most fun drawing a scene where I recreated a hike that Jack Kerouac took in the Sierras with Gary Snyder. I actually went with my partner and we hiked up this same mountain, which was scary and difficult. But then drawing it was actually even scarier and more difficult. Like this whole mountainscape scene was very intense, but also really absorbing and fun to draw.
Yeah, amazing. And is there something that didn't make it in?
Oh my God, 70,000 pages didn't make it in. I always want to write about everything, and I cram it all in, and at a certain point I realize that's not going to work. So I just take most of it out, and then I'm left with something.
Okay, amazing. All right. Rivers, what about you? What was the...
Yeah, I have two things. One, I really enjoyed sort of that narrative of like kind of surviving alone in the woods and twisting it, that like shows up in so much children's literature that I like loved as a child. You know, the kind of the boy with his knife and like, you know, making his whole world and fucking eating berries and making a bow and stuff like that. I loved so much to write that and like live vicariously through that with a character who's not a character that you see doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
And then I also really, really loved writing like really like hot erotic sex between lesbians and like, you know, just like putting that shit in there and not holding back at all. That was really, really fun and also really scary to like put that out there and stuff. So it you know, it was good. It was, yeah, what did we use? Cathartic, yeah. As far as what didn't make it in, yeah, I don't know. I can't think of anything specific. You know, large portions of it.
I know. Just when I ask that question, is it just like, well, that's 100 pages of which thing say? But appreciation posts for both of those cathartic moments, like appreciation, love for that. And Torrey, what about you?
I really had fun writing the Wim Hof scene. Wim Hof, for people who haven't read the book, is the guy who basically says you can cure all of your problems by going to freezing cold water and just sitting in it. It's the Wim Hof method. So that was fun. Like I was trying to come up with an ending and I was a little stymied. And then I heard a podcast with Wim Hof being like, just go in the water. It solves everything. And I was like, that's going to solve my book. So that was the end of, that was fun to write, to get that. And then the thing that didn't make it is that I found out really in the editing process that like my editor was like, you always tell two jokes whenever you do anything. And I didn't notice this. It was like, you tell two jokes, you tell one good joke, and then you tell a different version of that same joke to a lesser effect. And so, and then
Wait,
I
was
looked
it
and
Victory Matsui that said that to you?
It was Caitlin actually who had said
Oh,
it.
amazing.
Right?
Okay,
Yeah. And so, and it was like, and so then I basically had to go through it and basically be like, oh no, it's true. I always do two jokes. And sometimes, I will say sometimes the first one wasn't as good. I was building to the second joke that was worthwhile. But so I had to like cut like half the jokes because it was like, yeah, this is a tick that I have. It's like, if you didn't get it the first time, let me try it this way. It's like, just people are like, just trust yourself, Torrey. The joke's it's there. So
that's kind of a great humbling moment. That's a good thing to know. Now, you're like, I don't do that anymore. I don't do that.
I'm sure I still do because I'm like sitting here, you know how it is. It's like you're alone and you're like, you make yourself laugh once and it feels good and you're like, I'm going to do it again.
Totally. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, we have a question from Iris, who said, I was wondering if you all could talk about the interplay between academia or using theory/queer theory in your works. Sorrowland had a big theme of uniliteracy versus go-go, being really well-read in theory, plus psychoanalysis, is so intrinsic to Bechdel's works. What do you guys feel about that?
Rivers, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I just like crush on a lot of girls who are like really into theory. Like it's that simple for me. But I do think, I don't know, like it's really interesting. I think so much of theory and like queer theory specifically, but other types of theory are so much about how we sort of make ourselves up and like build ourselves into a narrative. And I don't know. I mean, I don't understand a lot of it. And like, I hope that, you know, I like represented those sort of like these texts well, as something that do sort of bring real like sort of meaning to people's lives. But yeah, like semiotics, assemblages, I don't know what it means, but
it's all in there.
Yeah, I love theory. You know, I would always poke fun at my academic characters in my comic strip, but not in a mean way. Like, I really do believe that theory is saving us, you know, in some way. And when I was writing my book where I have all this psychoanalysis saved me, and I wanted to figure out why, and I wanted to share that. And I think I might have actually erred a little bit too much on the theory heaviness. I wish I could go back and cut some of that out from that book. I think it would have been more effective. But that's the trick of it, you know. How do you weave something so cerebral into a story without grinding the story to a halt?
Yeah.
For me, I think that the problem, or maybe the challenge, is that when you're writing about trans girls, especially like in this day and age of like Twitter and things, or Tumblr, is that everybody actually already talks in theory. You know, like when they're talking about being trans, they're like, well, this performative thing I did, or this, you know, XYZ. And it's like, so it's like it was almost like the problem was taking it out, because when people, if you're actually realistically documenting how people are talking, they're actually sitting around with each other, talking in theory with each other. And it's not, I don't even think it's just an academic thing. I think with the way that theory is like spread in social media and just like kind of popular culture, you can't help but like run into these words. And sometimes I think it can be unnatural, insofar as to make a story work. You have to make people talk not like how we actually talk, which is laden with theory. You have to be like, I'm going to make these people use like terse, direct quotes. And in fact, that's not how people I know talk. They're like, you know, to quote Adorno, or I don't know what they say, but like,
So appreciate that. That's an amazing reversal too, to kind of to do as an art form. You guys have all continued to publish. You've all been putting out work. I know, Torrey, they say it's a debut novel, but you were putting out other stuff before. And I'm curious about, because we usually have so many writers in these things, people that are both aspiring writers or in the middle of their career, or just sort of going forward from a hard place. I'm really curious about what the hardest part of the process was for you in the beginning, and what that is for you now, like where that has shifted now. What was the thing that sort of took you a minute to get your brain around and learn how to, that you know now, right? That you kind of understand, like, okay, this is the thing I have to know and how I have to move around, and what it kind of continues to be today. Alison, you want to start?
Do you mean in terms of craft or in terms of
either? It could be publishing, or it could be craft. This could be, I'm just asking to the writers, whatever way you want to answer that.
I mean, the first thing that occurs to me is that when I began cartooning in the 80s, I was drawn to that medium precisely because it was so in the margins. I knew no one was looking at it. Not only was I doing cartoons, which, you know, were very populist and lowbrow, I was doing cartoons about lesbians, which, you know, no one was interested in except 5 lesbians. But I needed that assurance of a certain measure of obscurity in order to do the work at all. That's because I was very timid. I didn't want to throw my hat into the fine art or the literary rings. So I got to grow up and mature sort of without that kind of intense pressure and scrutiny. But oddly, throughout my career, you know, queer stories and cartooning have both become much more like real, like things that the critical establishment is down with. and now those things have become just as scrutinized as everything else. So it's been interesting to have to kind of keep up with that and make myself big enough to like grapple with that shift and to really take up my own space in it.
Yeah. Yep. That makes sense. Torrey, what about you?
And similarly, you know, my first stuff that I published was I self-published these little novellas, and it was similar. It was like the obscurity of that allowed me to say whatever I wanted, and I was able to write about things that I think I didn't have any fear of, like an audience being like, what are they gonna do when they do this? Like, and the experience of publishing this book on a big press and in you know, multiple regions, and like my big fear going forward is that it will have a chilling effect on me, like that having had people, you know, attack, you know, there was some transphobic reactions to the book, and personal attacks, and I'm afraid of the voice in my head going forward that'll be like, when I write something that I think is good, that voice being like, this is going to catch you a lot of grief in 2 years, you know, or whenever, how many years it is. And so there's a way in which I yearn for like when I self-published it, I controlled everything, including in some ways the audience, and that it's requiring this moment of, in some ways, bravery and moving forward, learning how to tune that stuff out so that I hopefully will be able to write the next one and not be chilled in that endeavor.
Yeah, I really hear that. Yeah. Rivers, what about you?
Yeah, I think for me, there's a bit more just, I don't know, lately I've actually been kind of questioning, like, do I want to continue publishing? You know, sort of through this apparatus, the specific machine that, you know, highlights and uplifts specific voices and has a kind of, you know, a few tokens or whatever that it can use to sort of like legitimize itself as radical or progressive, and wondering, but also wondering alternatively, though, does boycotting it or stepping aside from it actually change anything or move the needle, and all of these questions. And I think when I started out, all I wanted to do, if you had asked me, you know, I would have maybe said something like, oh, you know, I want to reach people with my art, and all of this stuff. But it's like, really, it's like, oh, I just wanted to be famous. I wanted to be like loved and cherished, and, you know, and, you know, and yeah, write things that were meaningful and that people found meaningful. But now it's becoming more difficult to separate what I produce in the text from the machine of publishing and sort of so many of the ills that it perpetuates. So that's kind of like a dark answer, I guess. But you've like caught me mid sort of existential crisis. So
okay. No, I really appreciate. I have to say, I really appreciate the dark answer, because I feel like we all have that.
Yeah,
and it's really
thank you, Rivers. Very well put.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, I have time for one last question, just under the needle. There is Meryl, a queer trans high school student, wanted to say that I highly admire and look up to all these people in this panel as queer role models. I was wondering, what advice do you have for aspiring young queer writers?
I'm always very reluctant to give advice because I never take advice.
Great. That's a good one. Don't take advice.
Yeah, that's my advice. Don't listen to anyone.
That's a fair one.
My advice is to find your audience. That was what meant something for me. Instead of writing sort of for everybody, when I began to think that like I'm writing for like these 6 friends, suddenly I realized I had something urgent to say to those 6. I don't have anything particularly urgent to say to the entire world, but I have something extremely urgent to say to like 6 friends of mine. and I want to do something for 6 friends of mine. And so if you can think of an audience that's like 6 people who you have something important to say or urgent to say, that for me is what allowed me to sort of find my voice and find an urgency to my writing.
Amazing. Thank you. Rivers.
I think for me, I would say, don't get caught up in trying to like make your art good. Just like do what brings you joy and what interests you, and follow your interests and passions and be weird.
Love that. Thank
Yeah,
you.
I agree with that too.
Absolutely. We are out of time. I could have talked to you guys all afternoon. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for talking. This was amazing. And thank you, Penn, for having us. I think we will transition out of this now. And I just want to say I appreciate so much that you guys brought yourself to this conversation. And thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.